The morning room smelled of lavender water and cold stone, and Lady Dorothea Weston was standing precisely where she always stood when she wished to be understood as the authority in a room. Beside the mantelpiece, one hand resting on the marble shelf, the other holding a folded letter she had not been invited to read but had read nonetheless. The pale March light came through the tall windows and fell across the Turkey carpet in long, watery strips, and Philippa stood in the center of them, her hands folded, her back straight, her face arranged into the particular expression she had been perfecting for 11 months, the one that looked like patience but was, in truth, something closer to masonry. A wall built of composure, mortared with silence, and tested now, as it was tested every Tuesday and Thursday when Dorothea found occasion to instruct her on what she was not. "You must understand," Dorothea said, and her voice was measured, careful, inflected with the particular courtesy that made everything she said worse, "that I do not say this to wound you." Philippa said nothing. She had learned that Dorothea's preambles were load-bearing. They held up the structure of what came next, and interrupting them only delayed the architecture of the insult without altering its design. "But you are not what this family required." Dorothea turned the letter in her fingers. It was from the Countess of Ashwick, an invitation to a house party in June that had been addressed to the Duchess of Weston and opened by the Duke's sister before it reached the Duchess's writing desk. Alaric needed someone who understood the weight of this house, the name, the expectations that attend a seat in the House of Lords and estates in 3 counties. He needed someone raised to it, bred to it, if you will forgive the plainness. The word bred landed in the room like a coin on marble. Philippa heard it. She absorbed it. She let it settle into the place where she kept such things, the quiet archive of remarks collected over 11 months of marriage, catalogued without comment, never answered, never forgotten. Dorothea continued. She always continued. "Your father was a clergyman, a good man, I have no doubt, and your mother kept a respectable house, and you were educated well enough to pass in a drawing-room for an evening. But an evening is not a life, Philippa. A life in this house requires—" She paused, as though searching for the precise word, though Philippa knew she had selected it hours ago. "Substance, the kind that cannot be learned. You may learn to arrange a table. You may learn which fork precedes which course and when to stand and when to remain seated. But you cannot learn to be enough, not for this family, not for this house, and not, I'm afraid, for my brother." The fire in the grate popped. A log shifted and sent a spray of embers against the iron screen, and for a moment the room was full of the sound of settling wood, and nothing else. "I do not say this because I dislike you," Dorothea said, and the worst of it was that she meant it. She was not a woman who traded in deliberate cruelty. She believed, with the unshakable certainty of a woman who had been born in this house and had never been asked to prove her place in it, that she was being kind, that naming the deficit was a mercy, like telling a swimmer the current was too strong before she drowned. "I say it because someone must. Alaric will not. He is too courteous, too conscious of duty. He married you because father wished it, and because you presented yourself well at the Ashwick ball, and because he is not a man who revisits a decision once made. But courtesy is not love, Philippa. Duty is not regard. And you must know, you must have felt it, that there is a difference between being chosen and being settled for." Philippa's hands remained folded. Her breathing did not change. The dove-gray wool of her morning dress was pressed and immaculate, the high empire waist fitted with the precision Mrs. Blythe insisted upon, the long sleeves buttoned to the wrist, with 18 small covered buttons that Neil fastened every morning while Philippa sat at the dressing table and watched the park through the window and said nothing about what the day would bring, because the days, by now, had a rhythm she could predict entirely. Breakfast with Alaric, who read the papers and asked if she had slept well, and accepted her answer without interrogation. The morning room, where Dorothea held court. The afternoon, when Philippa walked the grounds or visited the tenants or sat with Mrs. Blythe reviewing the household accounts that Dorothea believed she managed, but that Philippa had been running quietly and completely since August. "You will never be enough," Dorothea said. She said it as though she were reading a verdict rather than delivering one, as though the conclusion had been reached long ago by forces larger than herself, and she was merely the instrument of its announcement. "Not for the Westons, not for this house, and I think, If you are honest with yourself, you already know it." The room held its breath, and behind Dorothea, in the doorway she had not troubled to check, because she had lived in this house for 31 years and had never once considered that a room she occupied might also be occupied by someone she had not invited. Alaric Weston, Duke of Weston, stood with one shoulder against the doorframe, his arms crossed, his face utterly still. He was wearing the dark green riding coat he had put on after breakfast, with the intention of inspecting the drainage work on the south fields, and his boots were still clean, which meant he had not yet left the house, which meant he had come through the hall on his way to the stables, and had stopped because he heard his sister's voice and his wife's silence, and the silence had told him more than the voice. He had been there since bread. Dorothea did not know. She had positioned herself with her back to the door, facing Philippa, the posture of a woman delivering a private judgment that she believed would never reach the bench. Her hand was still on the mantelpiece. The letter from the Countess of Ashwick was still in her fingers, the seal broken by hands that had no right to break it. Philippa saw him. She saw him in the doorway with his arms crossed and his face arranged into the expression she had seen only twice before. Once when a tenant steward had falsified accounts and been dismissed without appeal, and once when a letter had arrived from a cousin requesting money with a tone that presumed entitlement. It was not anger. Alaric Weston did not do anger the way other men did, loudly and immediately and with the satisfaction of release. What he did was colder and more final. He arrived at a conclusion, and then he acted on it, and between the conclusion and the action there was a silence that cost more than shouting ever could. Philippa did not look at him. She did not signal, did not shift her gaze, did not allow her expression to change in any way that might have warned Dorothea. Not because she wished to see the sister caught, she was not a woman who dealt in traps, but because there was nothing to signal. Whatever Alaric had heard, whatever he decided, it would be his decision. She had endured 11 months of Dorothea's verdicts without requesting rescue, and she did not intend to request it now. Dorothea smoothed the letter against the marble. "I shall write to the Countess myself," she said, and her tone had shifted into the administrative register that Philippa recognized as the sound of a woman who believed she had won a private argument and was now arranging the consequences. "The house party in June. I think it best if I attend in your place. Alaric will understand. These are families who have known the Westons for generations, and they will expect—" "Dorothea." The word came from the doorway, one word, her name, spoken in the voice Alaric used in the House of Lords when he wished the gallery to go quiet, not raised, not sharpened, simply placed in the air with the weight of a man who understood that volume was the tool of men who lacked authority. Dorothea turned. The color left her face in stages, first the cheeks, then the lips, then the fine skin at her throat where the high lace collar of her morning dress met the pale column of her neck. She saw her brother in the doorway. She saw his arms crossed. She saw his face, and she understood in the space of a single breath that the private judgment she had been delivering was no longer private, and had perhaps never been, and that the silence she had mistaken for an empty hallway had been, in fact, a witness. "How long have you been standing there?" she asked. Her voice was steady. She was a Weston, and Westons did not falter in public, even when the public was a room containing only 3. "Long enough," Alaric said. He did not move from the doorway. He did not enter the room. The threshold was, in that moment, a border, the line between the space Dorothea had claimed and the space he was about to reclaim, and he held it with the stillness of a man who understood that architecture could be an argument. "You will return the Countess's letter to my wife's writing desk," he said. "You will not open her correspondence again. You will not attend the house party in June. You will not attend anything in her name or speak on her behalf or make any decision regarding the household, the tenants, the staff, or the manner in which this house is run. You have not been running this house, Dorothea. She has. Since August. If you did not notice, that is precisely the proof of how well she has done it." Dorothea's hand came off the mantelpiece. "Alaric, I heard what you were trying to do." His voice remained level. There was no heat in it, no tremor, no crack through which emotion might leak and soften what he was saying. "You were trying to persuade my wife that she is insufficient. You have been trying for 11 months. I have watched you try at breakfast, in the drawing room, at the table when we have guests, in the garden when you believed I was writing. I have heard the remarks about her father. I have heard the observations about her education. I have heard every version of the speech you just delivered, Dorothea, because you have delivered it in fragments, small enough to deny, frequent enough to wound, and always, always when you believed I was not present. The fire popped again. Embers scattered behind the screen. The March light had shifted, grown stronger as a cloud moved off, and the morning room was suddenly very bright. The cream wallpaper, the blue damask chairs, the turkey carpet with its faded medallions. And in that brightness, Dorothea looked for the first time exposed. Not chastened, exposed. The way a painting looks when the curtain drawn over it is pulled back and the colors prove less vivid than memory had insisted. She is a clergyman's daughter, Dorothea said, and there was something in her voice now that was not defiance, but conviction, the deep, structural certainty of a woman who had built her understanding of the world on a foundation she could not afford to question. She was not raised to this. She does not know what it costs to carry a name like ours. She carries it better than you do, Alaric said. She has carried it without your help, without your approval, and without a single complaint to me about your conduct, though she has had cause, daily cause, to make one. She has sat through every breakfast with you and kept her composure. She has endured every remark and said nothing. She has run the house you believed you were running, and done it so quietly that you did not even notice your own irrelevance. That is not the behavior of a woman who is not enough, Dorothea. That is the behavior of a woman who is more than this family deserved, and I include myself in that judgment. Philippa's hands tightened in her lap. Just slightly. Just the smallest contraction of her fingers against each other, invisible to anyone who was not looking for it, and Alaric was not looking at her. He was looking at his sister. But the tightening was there, the only outward sign that 11 months of silence had just been answered by someone other than herself, and the answer had been more complete than anything she might have said. "I want you to leave Weston Hall," Alaric said. Dorothea's chin lifted. "You cannot mean that." "I mean it entirely. I will have Dallow arrange a carriage. You will go to Aunt Louisa in Bath. The house is comfortable, the city is lively, and you will find company more suited to your opinions. I should like you gone by noon." "By noon?" She repeated it as though the schedule were the outrage rather than the exile. "Alaric, I have lived in this house since I was born. And my wife has lived in it for 11 months, during which time you have made it clear, repeatedly and with considerable effort, that she does not belong in it. I am resolving the contradiction. If one of you must feel unwelcome, it will not be her." He uncrossed his arms. He stepped back from the doorway. One step, no more, and the step opened the passage behind him. The hallway stretched toward the main staircase, and the gesture was unmistakable. The way was clear. The conversation was over. "I suggest you begin packing," he said. "Mrs. Blythe will send Neil to assist you." Dorothea stood very still. She was a woman who had managed rooms and relatives and social occasions for 31 years with the confidence of someone who had never been asked to justify her position, and being asked to leave, not asked, told, was so far outside her experience that for a moment she could not arrange her face into any expression at all. She stood blank and exposed in the bright morning light. And then something shifted in her bearing, not defeat, not yet, but the recognition that the ground she had been standing on had been removed and there was nothing beneath her feet but air. She set the Countess's letter on the mantelpiece. She walked to the doorway. She paused beside her brother, close enough to speak quietly, close enough for a private word. And Alaric did not move, did not lean in, did not offer the softening that a private word would have required. He stood and let her pass, and she passed, and her footsteps on the hall floor were the only sound in the house. Neil was in the corridor outside the morning room. She had been polishing the silver salver on the side table, a task she performed every Tuesday morning, a task that placed her within earshot of a room she had never intended to eavesdrop upon but could not, given the acoustics of a house built in 1742, fail to hear. She stood with the cloth in her hand and watched Lady Dorothea walk toward the staircase with the posture of a woman ascending a scaffold, straight-backed, chin raised, steps measured. And then she looked at the morning-room doorway where the Duke stood, and he looked at her and she curtsied, and he nodded, and neither of them spoke because there was nothing to speak about. What had happened, and the house would rearrange itself around the absence, as houses do. The marriage had been arranged in January, settled by March, and performed in April in the stone chapel at Weston Hall, with campion along the altar rail and a wind that rattled the vestry windows. Philippa's father, the Reverend Mr. Selwyn, had read the second lesson himself. A quiet man with ink-stained fingers and a living worth £90 a year, standing at the lectern of a chapel whose candlesticks alone were worth more than his annual income, reading from Corinthians with the steady voice of a man who trusted words even when the occasion outstripped him. Her mother had died when Philippa was 14. There had been no one to advise her on what a duke's household would require, no one to warn her that the sister who greeted her in the entrance hall with a smile and a curtsy and a perfectly judged compliment about her traveling dress would, within a fortnight, begin the long, patient work of making her feel small. Dorothea had begun with the menus. Small suggestions: a different fish, a better cut of beef, the observation that the late Duchess had always preferred the Sèvres porcelain for formal dinners, delivered with the implication that Philippa could not have known, could not be expected to know. Because how could a clergyman's daughter from a village rectory understand the difference between Sèvres and Wedgwood, between what was done and what was merely adequate? Then the seating arrangements, then the flowers, then the correspondence, letters opened, invitations answered, decisions made before Philippa could reach her writing desk, always with the same careful courtesy, always with the same unspoken premise: I am helping you because you cannot help yourself. By August, Philippa had understood, not suspected, understood the way one understands weather or gravity, through repeated exposure rather than explanation. And she had begun, with the same quiet method she brought to everything, to take back what was hers. The accounts, first, then the tenants, then the household staff who had been waiting, Mrs. Blythe especially, for someone to give them clear instruction instead of competing instruction, and who had recognized in Philippa's steady, specific directions the authority that Dorothea's confident generalities had never quite achieved. The carriage was ordered at 10:30. Dallow, who had been steward at Weston Hall for 9 years and had served the late Duke before Alaric, arranged it with the efficiency of a man who understood that the instruction by noon was not a suggestion, but a boundary, and that the Duke of Weston set boundaries the way he set fence posts, once, deeply, and without expectation of moving them. Dorothea's trunks came down the main staircase at 11:15. 2 footmen carried them. Mrs. Blythe supervised, her face impassive, her ring of keys silent at her waist. She had learned years ago to keep them still when the house was in tension, because the sound of keys was the sound of authority, and in a house with Lady Dorothea, authority had always been a contested territory. Philippa did not watch the trunks come down. She remained in the morning room. She sat in the chair by the window, not the chair Dorothea favored beside the mantelpiece, but the one she had claimed for herself in the first week of her marriage, the one that looked out over the south lawn where the crocuses were just beginning to push through the frost-damaged beds. She sat, and she breathed, and she let the silence of the room settle around her like a garment that finally fit. Alaric came in at 11. He closed the door behind him, not firmly, not with the emphasis of a man who wished to signal the weight of what he was about to say, but quietly, the way one closes a door when the house has been too loud and what is needed is containment. He sat in the chair opposite hers, the chair Dorothea had never offered him, because Dorothea arranged the morning room as though it were hers, and Alaric had permitted it because he did not care about rooms, only about the people in them, and until this morning he had not understood how much damage a room could do when the wrong person controlled it. He did not ask if she was all right. He did not ask how she felt, or whether Dorothea had said such things before, or how long she had been bearing it. He knew the answers. He had known them, she understood now, for longer than this morning, had known them in the way he knew the drainage on the south fields, or the condition of the roof in the east wing, through observation rather than report, and had waited, as he waited for everything, until the evidence was complete and the action could be total. "You heard her say it before," Philippa said. It was not a question. Fragments, at breakfast, in the hallway, when she believed the door was closed and I was in the study. He was looking at his hands, which were resting on his knees. Large hands, capable hands, the hands of a man who still rode his own fences and checked his own gates, though he had a steward and a stable master and 30 men who could do it for him. I should have spoken sooner. Why didn't you? He looked up. His eyes were dark, steady, and there was something in them that she had not seen before. Not guilt, because Alaric did not trade in guilt any more than he traded in anger, but accountability. The willingness to stand inside a failure and name it without flinching. Because I thought you might prefer to fight your own war, he said. I believed, that if I intervened it would diminish what you had built here. You have built a great deal, Philippa, quietly, without assistance, without acknowledgement, and I did not wish to be the man who swept in and rescued a woman who had never once asked to be rescued. I didn't. No, you didn't. Not once. Not when she opened the letter from Lady Chesham, not when she rearranged the seating at the Michaelmas dinner and placed you below the wife of a baronet in your own house. Not when she told Mrs. Blythe to disregard your instructions about the linens, and Mrs. Blythe came to you in the still-room, mortified, and you simply repeated the instruction without raising your voice or mentioning Dorothea's name. I know about that. Mrs. Blythe did not tell me. I heard her telling Dallow, in the servants' hall, that the Duchess had more authority in her quiet than Lady Dorothea had in all her years of noise. Philippa looked at him. You hear a great deal for a man who is always in his study. The study door is thinner than Dorothea believes. A sound escaped her, not quite a laugh, not yet, but the shape of one, the ghost of amusement surfacing through 11 months of careful stillness, and Alaric looked at her with an expression she had not seen before. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. The face of a man discovering that the woman sitting across from him was funnier than he had known, and that the discovery was his failure rather than her concealment. And I was wrong to wait, because what I heard this morning was not a battle. It was a siege, and she was not engaging you. She was eroding you, slowly, carefully, with the patience of a woman who believed she had all the time in the world, because she believed no one was counting the cost. He reached across the space between their chairs. Not far. The chairs were close, closer than Dorothea had ever placed them, because Dorothea arranged furniture for performance, and Philippa had rearranged it weeks ago for conversation. He took her hand. He held it, not tightly, not with the desperate grip of a man who feared losing something, but with the steady pressure of a man who had decided to hold on and meant to continue. I counted the cost, he said, every remark, every opened letter, every Tuesday and Thursday when she positioned herself in this room and made you smaller. I counted, and I did nothing. And this morning I stood in that doorway and heard the total, and the total was unconscionable. You did not do nothing, Philippa said quietly. You stood. I stood too late. You stood. The crocuses outside the window caught the strengthening light, purple and yellow and white, pushing through frozen ground with the particular stubbornness of things that had been buried and refused to remain so. Philippa looked at them, and then looked at her husband, and understood that what had happened in this room, not the confrontation, not the dismissal, but this, the afterward, the quiet between two people who were learning to sit together without performance, was the thing she had been waiting 11 months to feel, without knowing she was waiting for it. The carriage left at 10 minutes to noon. Dorothea descended the front steps in a traveling pelisse of dark blue wool with a matching bonnet, her gloves buttoned, her expression composed into the mask of a woman who intended to present her departure as a choice rather than a consequence. She did not look back at the house. She did not look at the morning-room window, where Philippa was not standing, because Philippa had no interest in watching the departure, only in knowing it had occurred. Sir Haddon Price, riding past the gates of Weston Hall on his way to the village, saw the carriage turn onto the main road, and noted the Weston crest on the door and Lady Dorothea's profile in the window. He mentioned it to his wife over luncheon. His wife mentioned it to Mrs. Price the elder. By Tuesday, the parish understood that Lady Dorothea Weston had removed to Bath, and by Thursday, the parish understood why, because parishes always understand why, even when no one has said a word, because the absence of explanation is its own explanation. And 31 years of Lady Dorothea's authority had generated enough silent resentment among the tenants and the village and the household staff that her departure was met not with shock, but with the particular quiet satisfaction of a debt finally collected. Mrs. Blythe brought tea to the morning room at 4 o'clock. She set the tray on the table between the two chairs that were now positioned for conversation rather than performance, and she poured for the Duchess, and she said nothing about the morning because Mrs. Blythe was a woman who understood that the most important things said in a house were said by the furniture, by which chairs were moved, which doors were closed, which rooms were reclaimed, and the morning room had said everything that needed saying. Dallow reported that evening that Lady Dorothea's rooms had been cleared and cleaned and could be prepared for guest use whenever her grace wished. Philippa thanked him and said there was no hurry. The rooms would keep. Everything now would keep. Spring came to Weston Hall the way spring comes to old houses, slowly, unevenly, with setbacks and false starts, and days when the frost returned and the crocuses bent under it and then straightened again. Philippa opened the windows in the morning room and let the air move through. She rehung 2 paintings that Dorothea had chosen and replaced them with watercolors from the attic that the late Duchess, Alaric's mother, had painted in the 1790s. She moved the writing desk to the window, where the light was best, and answered the Countess of Ashwick's invitation herself in her own hand, excepting for June. Alaric watched her do it. He watched the way he had always watched, from the edges, from the hallway, from the chair he now occupied every morning after breakfast instead of retreating to the study. But the watching had changed. It was no longer the observation of a man cataloguing evidence. It was the attention of a man who had discovered that the woman he married for composure was also a woman of substance, and that the substance had been there all along, growing in the dark like the crocuses, waiting only for someone to stop standing over it and let the light in. "You are staring," Philippa said, without looking up from her correspondence. "I am attending," Alaric said. "There is a difference. I have been informed by a very reliable source that attention is what separates courtesy from regard." "Who is this reliable source?" "My wife. She has not said it. She has simply demonstrated it for 11 months, and I have been slow to read the demonstration, but I'm reading it now." She looked up. She smiled. It was not the careful, measured smile she had worn for 11 months, the one that said, "I am well," and required no further investigation. It was a different smile, smaller, truer, the kind that begins in the eyes and does not bother to perform for the rest of the face. 2 years later, Lady Dorothea Weston returned to Weston Hall. She came in June, when the gardens were in full bloom, and the house was full of light and the sounds of a child, a daughter, Cecily, born the previous autumn, who was carried about the house by Neil and spoiled comprehensively by Mrs. Blythe, and placed on a blanket in the garden every afternoon, where she observed the world with her mother's composure and her father's dark, steady eyes. Dorothea did not arrive unannounced. She wrote first. She wrote to Philippa, not to Alaric, a letter that was not an apology, because Dorothea was not built for apologies, but an acknowledgment, which was harder. She acknowledged that she had been wrong. She did not explain why she had been wrong, because the why was obvious to anyone who had spent 2 years in Bath watching the world continue without her participation in it. She asked if she might visit. She used the word visit, not return, not come home, but visit, the word of a guest, not a resident, and the distinction was the apology she could not write. Philippa showed the letter to Alaric. He read it at the breakfast table, his teacup in one hand, the letter in the other, and when he finished, he set both down and looked at his wife. "What do you wish to do?" he asked. "I wish to invite her," Philippa said, "for a fortnight, as a guest." "You are sure?" "She is your sister. This is her family. She was wrong, and she has spent 2 years knowing it, and that is a consequence sufficient for a lifetime. I do not need her to grovel. I need her to see." "See what?" "That I was always enough, that the house runs, that the tenants are well, that your daughter has her grandmother's watercolors on her nursery wall, and her mother's crocuses in the garden, and a father who sits in the morning room every day after breakfast, because he has discovered that it is the best room in the house, not because of the light or the furniture, but because of who is in it." Dorothea arrived on a Tuesday. She was thinner than Philippa remembered, and quieter, and she stood in the entrance hall and looked at the house she had been born in and lived in for 31 years, and she saw it clearly for the first time. The watercolors in the morning room, the crocuses on the south lawn, the writing desk moved to the window where the light was best, the 2 chairs arranged for conversation, and she understood that the woman she had called insufficient had made the house into something it had never been under her stewardship, a home, not a monument to lineage or a stage for performance, but a home where the doors were open and the tea was hot, and a child's laughter came from the garden, and a duke sat in a morning room reading his papers, not because he had nowhere else to go, but because there was nowhere else he wished to be. She stayed the fortnight. She held Cecily once, awkwardly, in the garden, and the child grabbed her pearl earring and pulled, and Dorothea laughed, a sound so unexpected that Mrs. Blythe, who was crossing the hall, stopped and listened, and then continued walking with the faintest alteration in her expression that might, in a woman less composed, have been called a smile. On the last day, Dorothea found Philippa in the morning room. She stood in the doorway, the same doorway where Alaric had stood 2 years before, the same threshold that had divided the room from the hallway and the old order from the new, and she said, "You were right. You were always right, and I am sorry I could not see it." Philippa looked up from her letters. "Sit down, Dorothea," she said. "The tea is still warm." Dorothea sat. She sat in the chair beside the window, not the chair by the mantelpiece, which no one sat in anymore because it had been removed and replaced with a small table where Cecily's wooden blocks were kept. And she accepted the tea that Philippa poured, and she drank it. And outside the window, the garden was bright with the roses and lavender and sweet peas that Philippa had planted in the beds where nothing had grown for years. And the house was quiet, and the morning was long, and neither of them said anything else, because the silence between them had finally become the kind that did not need filling. They arrive here, like a door held open by someone who once closed it whenever they are ready,